Now, this afternoon, the title of my presentation is A Crisis in the Humanities, ? And a subtitle, Challenges of Culture in Modern Societies. I would say reconsidered. Since the paper is all available in Chinese translation, and to my knowledge that some of you have read it or will read it, I shall not read the paper once again, but recall the main points. And I shall then make some remarks on points that in the present situation should be added. Basically, due to changes in our societies in recent years, let's say 10 last years, such as the status and role of culture in modern societies, culture matters, revitalization of religion, and to reconstructions of universities, at least in Europe, in recent years, towards a market-oriented model. So, the point of departure in this paper is that if there is a crisis in humanities, it's not just a question of money. As any academic discipline, also the humanities have to justify what we are doing in order to get money. We have to establish the credentials for our activities. And I take it there are three main ways of justifying what we are doing. The first one is general for all academic work. Truth, the inherent value of truth and of truth-seeking. Recall the quotation in the old campus, seek truth, foster originality, live up to the name of our teacher. I like that. Yes. Okay, seek truth, the first one. Then, usefulness, and I'll come back to that. And finally, that which is culturally formative. And I'll come back to that. But first, briefly on truth. I think this is basic, but not maybe the argument that is used mostly in order to get money. It was more an argument in order to be allowed to do what we do. Think about history. Think about Bruno and Galilei. Think about what happened during the Nazi regime in Germany or in the Soviet Union, where things were not allowed to do. So it's basic, but not the basic issue when it comes to the situation today, I take it, and to the question of getting money. But there is one point here, and that is all truth worthwhile having? Is it worthwhile knowing the day of your death? I doubt it. Is it worthwhile knowing what kind of genetic diseases you might carry on which are incurable? I doubt it. So in biomedical ethics, there are truths that maybe should not be so. But in general, I would say yes. And I'll come back to maybe some aspects to it later as to not legal, but institutional constraints. Now, the first real point here is a question of usefulness. And usefulness might be various things. But very often it's a question of getting a means, a way of achieving some goal that is regarded as desirable. In that sense, that which is useful has an instrumental usage to it. You use it instrumentally as an instrument, as a means to achieve something. That is what is called purposive rationality. It's a technical term, but it means a kind of rationality where you have some goal and you find some means, and these means will lead you or lead you better to the goal that you have chosen or that you have gotten. Now, in this paper, I refer to a famous pedagogically well-taken case, I think, by a theoretician, Hempel. I just rephrase it briefly. The case he's trying to explain, it shows something about instrumental usage. That's the point. And the case is that of a car. A lot of Chinese do have cars now and then it's even cold here in Shanghai. Be careful at night if you put water into the radiator and leave the car outdoors. It might break. And now, Hempel's case is just this. How do you explain that the radiator broke when it was full of water and stood for a long time in a frosty night? then he says there are two elements. First, we have a general law. We know by experiments and experience that water, when it freezes, expands with a certain force. That's a general law established. First point, the general law. Second point, we have a description of a state of affairs. Namely, the car was there, it was filled with water in the radiator, the temperature went under zero, and it stood there for a long time. Description of a factual situation. Then, inference. Because water expands with a certain force, and because the car was there, therefore the radiator broke. So, an explanation is then an inference, a deduction by general law, a description of a state of affairs, and then the inference. So, this is then a case of how you explain something in the past, a way of explaining. But see, the structure is exactly the same if you want to predict what will happen in the future. If you want to have your neighbor's radiator break, then just fill the water in the radiator, pull it out in the street, let it be there a cold night, and see the radiator will break down. So, what is an explanation of the past is a prediction of the future. And then, third point, then you can use it. Either if you want to have the radiator to break, or you have it not to break, which means you can use it instrumentally in order to control natural processes and events. And that's not the point. This is a way of getting knowledge which leads to instrumental usage. Okay, let be like that. It's sure much more to be said what's going on in natural sciences, but this is just a case from Do I speak too fast? Okay, you speak up. It's not my language. It's not your language.
We speak foreign language.
Okay, well, so, now, the point is here a double one. The first, this usefulness argument in justification of what we are doing in the scientific academic discipline does not work well for the humanities. That's my first point. A negative point, a demarcation. This doesn't work for most of what we are doing. So what should we say then? Well, come back to that. But notice, and that's the second point here, this fits to a certain way of thinking in economic terms. When we talk about useful values in academic political speech today, it's very often a question of getting economic values, production. So it fits to that, but it doesn't fit to the humanities. Let me just add 3 critical points to this notion of usefulness, which is, I mean, useful, and we use it, and it's okay, but one should be aware of at least 3 things. Useful for whom? That's always a question to ask. What is useful to some people might be harmful to others. What's useful for this generation might be harmful for the next generation. First point, for whom? Second point, well known for Karl Marx, purchase power is one thing, but real needs is another one. And if you have no money or working force to put into the market, you can't do much trade. So you might have real needs, but not being able to take part in the market. Or you may take part in the market because you have money, but no real needs to use the money for. So there is a question between the real needs and what you do on the market, a criticism. So, second point. Third point, usefulness is a, should we say, secondary language in the sense that if there is nothing which has a value in itself, nothing is useful. You can't ask, is life useful? That is a category mistake. It's like asking the question, what time is it on the sun? Because the sun is that which decides what the time it might be. So those who ask for the usefulness of the fundamental values, they are committing a category mistake. Now, I'll come back to this. As you see, with the new university political agendas, which work worldwide. I'm not sure about the Chinese situation, but in Europe at least, with the new university reconstructings, there is a tendency to ask for products in terms of research or students being examined and given credits, etc. And I'll come back to it, but because, and that's my point, I think the humanities do have a problem in that respect. Now, that was concerning the second way of justifying usefulness. Now, the final one. That is for the humanities. What, more positively, what we do in the humanities, I mean, lots of things. It's very heterogeneous. We should say we interpret, try to understand, rather than to obtain instrumental knowledge. At this point, I would like to add that the English language, when they talk about science, I talked about natural science. I'm not sure about Chinese, but in German and in Scandinavian language, when we say science, Wissenschaft or Wissenschaft, that means all academic fields. So when I talk about the sciences here, I include the humanities in the whole thing. And also, to recall some historical facts, if you look at the European universities, there were three main topics. They were theology, law, and medicine. Those were the main topics, actually. And from this, law and theology are not instrumental, but they are interpretive. They interpret laws, interpret sacred texts. It might be Confucius or whatever. I mean, you have it in China too. So interpret activities have a long history. And then the other things were the free arts. Basic research work went on outside the universities later in the Renaissance. But we have history, philology, studies of languages, studies of arts, literature, cultural studies, and philosophy. All these. Let's just mention it like that as a kind of set. Now, my first point will then be that, yeah, humanities are what I would call culturally formative. They form us. They are not used in the sense of instrumental usage, but that doesn't mean that they are not useful in another sense. I'll come back to it, but I would say that any society will also need culture and lead refinements and acquisition of culture. Not only for the individual, not only for recreation as a choice, something like that, but very basically in the society. It does matter. So in that sense, I think it's no doubt, we can take it in the argument, but I will strongly stress that point. I think it's pretty clear that the humanities are important, but not instrumentally, but for cultural formation. Now, second point, if you use your knowledge in a natural scientific subject, or use it in its technological version, for instance, concerning electricity, you can turn it on and off without having very much knowledge about electricity. So the usage of instrumental knowledge could be on various levels, and very often on a very shallow level, actually. But what does it mean to have any usage of Confucius, or Goethe, or Shakespeare? There is no other way than to plunge oneself into the matter, to play along, to immerse oneself into it. And that is to acquire a personal knowledge of it. We ourselves are part of the process. So the usage is actually, in that sense, formative. The Germans say Bildung. For those of you who have some acquaintance with Germans. I mean, culturally formative. You have to appropriate it as a kind of cultural usage. If not, there's no way of what would it be to use it? Yeah, I mean, some people buy Confucius and Goethe and put it in the shelves to show their friends. But, I mean, that's conspicuous consumption and hypocrisy and whatnot. It's not really to acquire any insight into what are on these pages. Now, that means that in this case, there has to be another relationship between the researcher and the user. Should we say more intimate internal relationship. And also between the educator, the teacher, and the educated, the pupil. There has to be much more of an internal relationship. So that's now the second point. Then we could say, so far we have come to some kind of division. We have sort of natural sciences and humanities. We have explanation and understanding. And for those who are familiar with philosophy, you'll know that here we are in a vast field of ongoing discussions. And as it is always the case, such clear-cut divisions might be useful, but also in a certain sense of clarification, but also inadequate, because a lot of what's going on in natural sciences, think about cosmology or Darwinism, it's not much you can use that for in any instrumental sense, but they are crucial for our understanding of the universe and man in the universe, etc. So one should be careful in making the distinction too sharp. And I will also say in the natural sciences, to understand theoretical physics is not just to manipulate, but it's to understand how the universe is built in a way. So it's more complicated. And on the humanistic side, sure, I mean, if you bring in the social sciences, yeah. Are there general laws? Yeah. Most people would doubt it, but it's close to it. And in statistics, and many people would like to think it is, and there is something close to. I mean, and there is a whole question whether if you use those kinds of notions, there will be a reification in your view of human beings because you do not understand them, but you try to explain them causally, etc. The relationship, for those who have been into it, between a society which is based on understanding and morality and a society based on causal, objectivating, understanding and therapy. I mean, ongoing discussions again. Okay, but let's take a further step. Cultural formative. But what then about culture? Has to be appropriated. Yes, it has to be appropriated. Lots of cultural heritage will have to be appropriated. And that has to go on in an internalized way of getting at this personal language. But culture can always decline. It's not like a physical object. It needs to be transferred, but it needs also to be recreated. So there is a need both for taking over what is given and to recreate and to criticize. So there is, if you like, to use these terms, a conservative aspect to the preservation of culture and a radical aspect as to the renewation, the creativity and the criticism of what is not good, what should be better. Evaluation and criticism. So both aspects should be added. How? Well, that's an open question, and we have to look at the various cases. But it, I think, is important. There I would like to add a small note quickly. For those who are philosophers, who have been in contact with philosophers, we know that in this heritage of ours, there are also claims in Confucius, in Plato, in Kant, about how things are, how they must be, and how they should be. And there are claims. And how do you teach these things? Because there are so many different views. I will just, for those who are looking into this history of philosophy or mine, you will see some of these positions. But I'd say like this. First, one should try to situate a thinker in a historical setting. It does make a difference if you live in old Greece or in France or in China at a certain time. One has to see historically where it's situated. First point. Second point. To my mind, it's not very fruitful to start with the answers. In Bergen, it's raining a lot, very much. It's on the coast of Norway. And as some of you will know, the first Greek philosopher should have said that everything is water. And that is a tough start in the autumn term, even in Bergen, when everything is raining. No, I mean, if you take it word by word, it's unreasonable. It's sure not everything is water. But if one sees that this may be understood on the background, that this philosopher wanted to understand what are the elements that build the universe? And what are and how should change be understood?